Hey everyone, little guy with a penchant for Latvian drink and culture here. Today we're going over the long-rusted Iron Curtain to learn about a subculture of lads who we all know for three things: tracksuits, samički, and hardbass. I'll see you all there.
The story will continue after this.
So what exactly is a Gopnik? While the substitute teacher in me wants to wheel out this handy Life of Boris video, I'll try and sum it up here. A Gopnik is a term that described a particular subculture among working class youths from the former Soviet states, applying more to Russia, as there are similar terms in many other languages. Originating in the early years of the Soviet Union as a way to describe vagrant children and orphans who flooded into urban areas following the revolution and ensuing civil war, with many of them turning to criminal activities. The term itself is widely considered to come from the abbreviation of the Russian term for communal tenements, Gosudetstveni Obshchizhite Proletariata, abbreviated as GOP, with these children being considered of the GOP, or Gopniki. The term itself is the Russian equivalent of hick, but also has connotations as peasant and nowadays hooligan, or anything else with criminal notation. These Gopniki usually congregate in public places, wear Adidas or other brand name sportswear like tracksuits, are associated with the hardbass subgenre of house music, and do some hooligan actions. This subculture of working-class proletariat youths only came to the public attention a decade or so after the fall of the Soviet Union. So how did we get from no Gopniks to all this? Well, it all starts with the Soviet Union in the 80s. More specifically, the Moscow Olympics of 1980. Now, the Russian Olympic team needed tracksuits, so, to appear as in unison as Marx and Lenin had originally wanted, they went to German manufacturer Adidas for what those kids who stand outside my apartment block call Tatolji Slav Drip. If that term didn't make you cringe with me saying it, then you know where I'm going. Thanks mainly to the 1980s Olympics, Adidas was introduced to the USSR and would grow in popularity thanks to the brand status as a symbol of having it made or athleticism. Much like the Styliagi and their bones of bands, 80s Russian youths were enamored by something else from west of the wall. As for why it grew in popularity of the Gopniks, prisons in the USSR at the time did not have standard jumpsuits you see with any other nation. Rather, the inmates would wear tracksuits. Seeing as Adidas was popular, and many who we would call Gopniki wanted to look much like the tough gangsters, mobsters, and other hardened criminals, while holding the prestige of something like an Adidas tracksuit. So be it out front of apartment blocks or in a big house itself, the tracksuit would begin to staple itself in many facets of Soviet life. Speaking of big houses, in the later years of the 1980s and early 1990s, we would see the birth of a new subgenre of house music begin to rise. While the house genre itself was from Chicago, this British edition, called hard house or pumping house, would begin to take over rave clubs on the continent alongside more European techno music. The genres would mix in the late 1990s for something stylistically Russian, but we have a long way to get there from the days of the Soviet Union. Oh, those were the days, mój tovarish, back when Ostrov Stokovich wasn't a meme, and the glorious Union would last forever. Or at least as long as it could hold out against a large-scale geopolitical shift. From 1989 until its dissolution in 1991, the Soviet Union would be in an economic, cultural, and territorial downward spiral. Out of the ashes of a failed coup attempt and later reformation into a federal republic in 1991, a new Russian state rose. To put it briefly for our backdrop, the Russian Federation, and much of the former USSR of the 1990s, was one of economic hardship. It would be an era of government neglect where subcultures of Gopolta would begin to spring up in the suburbs of Russian cities. The Gopnik of the 1990s and early 2000s, who I will call the classic Gopnik, was based greatly off of urban youth and Russian prison culture. All the staples of a Gopnik, well, mostly the squatting and tracksuits, came from Russian prison and gulag culture, with squatting existing because chairs were not for those deemed enemies of the state, and tracksuits because the prisoner doesn't need anything outside of a number. Outside of uniformity in dress and taste in gatherings, a few of our sources cite the Gopnik as not having a particular taste in music, varying from rock to EDM or hip-hop. Seeing as such, the 90s Gopniki were more associated with Russian chanson than the music we know them for. But that was about to change. Remember that love child of house and techno I mentioned back in the early 90s? Well, here he is. Hardbass, a subgenre of house music with some techno influences, was born in the newly renamed St. Petersburg in the late 90s. Most sources point to 1997 or 1998 because Clubhead's distinct synth sound would be released in that time frame. So what exactly is Hardbass?
Welcome back to the Iron Curtain Hour with me, balding white guy with some kind of beard. Today we're talking about a Russian genre of club music called hard bass. Now hard bass is a Russian genre of club music. It's originated from the mid-1990s, and hard bass is different from house and techno music in its fast tempo. The occasional verses or two, and the iconic hard bounce. Here's an example. Now you learned what hard bass is. On the next tape in this series on the former Soviet Union, we're going to show you how to score big in the St. Petersburg club scene, with a few phrases that will impress the ladies and your fellow Patsons.
Now back to our program. Modern, in this sense, refers more to the Gopnik after the culture's heyday around the early 2000s, when, thanks to the internet, the West would learn about these cheeky chuvaks. The classic Gopnik was on the decline. To quote one of our sources, "Whenever an authentic subclass gets discovered by cooler people, it means that they're dead. History. Gone." That is what this article is about. Not only to introduce the Gopnik to the world, but also to announce the Gopnik's tragic death. Because whenever something hardcore gets cool, it's always a bad sign. The new Gopnik is still delinquent, eager to prove himself to his fellow Patsons or embracing the Russian way of protecting the last true bastion of culture against the Western world. That last one might be a bit of a stretch. Or is it? We'll touch on that later. What can be said is that the modern Gopnik, delinquent or not, made their way westward thanks to various sources on the internet over the next decade. Be it through memes or other forms of popular culture, the archetype of the squatting Slav would appear on image boards, forums, and videos showcasing the wackiness of a newly semi-democratic Russia. In a more postmodern sense, or well, post-postmodern if we want to get technical on our time frames, there's a more recentish emulation or cosplaying of Gopniks by a lot of people the world over. Whether it be out of just wanting to embrace the meme, or a more noticeable trend since at least the 90s with youth culture wherein the lifestyles of gangsters and other aspects of hip-hop culture have influenced young minds. This is a bit of a good thing though. It's like breaking the floodgates to the Gopnik subculture. And while there is a sense of irony with trust fund kids dressing like working class delinquents, there still existed some variation or other of the classic Gopnik. We're gonna go on a brief tangent because this guy introduced me to what a Gopnik is back in the mid-2010s. YouTubers like Life of Boris, a fine Russo-Estonian gentleman who I am currently within striking distance of, helped spread the Gopnik archetype more about specific corners of YouTube, while also giving insights into post-Soviet life. Albeit, Boris played it more for comedy. But what he does ranges from cooking into that window into post-Soviet life. Not just whatever parts of Gopnik culture made their way to Tallinn. Wikipedia even cites him for their article on Hardbass. So from the 2000s to the 2010s, we can see a developed sense of the Gopnik as that symbol of post-Soviet youth, with actual Gopniks fading slowly away. Be it either from the introverts working on their FPS skills, or actual street kids, the idea of the Gopnik and the Gopnik itself were always present in the years following the birth of the Russian Federation. Now, there is some debate whether the Gopnik is around or not, given that we see them more often as some caricatures than the more devious aspects they came from. Luckily, well, unluckily for their victims, the Gopnik lifestyle is going nowhere, as men young and old still take to the streets and squat wherever they can while causing some trouble to the tune of Semichki. So who exactly are these Gopniki? While they do vary in their motives, we can see a lot of similarities in their backgrounds, being working class, from Russian suburbs, and also having some experience with delinquency, such as petty crime or being violent. So, for a Western comparison, Think whatever gang of latchy kids that weren't the cool stoners at your local 7-Eleven. Or chavs, if you want something a tad bit more European. There also exist older Gopniks, if this picture here is anything to go by, with the lifestyle carrying with one beyond youth. Actually, these guys may just be mobsters if we want a different stereotype to go by. They also have something I keep overlooking anthropologically in the grand scheme of this channel: rituals. Gopnik rituals, most notably the gathering and squatting of a group of Gopniki somewhere, is more or less out of Russian prison culture's lack of chairs we mentioned earlier. But where it becomes more a Gopnik ritual is with two things: samichki, sunflower seeds, and music. Gopnik music isn't entirely hardbass, but the genre is greatly associated with them because of memes and what one of our sources deems a product of parody. Other music genres like blatnaya pesnya, known as Russian chanson in English, took hold of older generations, more as a carryover from Russian prison culture. But most Gopniks are into a wide variety of music, because it seems to be an unspoken rule of subcultures that unless you are explicitly a music fandom, you can listen to whatever. There also exists this Gopnik Code of Honor, which is somewhat another carryover from the more criminal origins of the Gopnik. Outside of one explicitly stated rule of not starting a fight without a cause, what sources we could find just left the code at that. If anything, it may be related to the informal penal code of Vory v Zakony, loosely translated to Law of Thieves, wherein there is an informal social hierarchy that exists within the prison itself, with some very laissez-faire oversight from the state. In the case of the Gopniks, the same code and its enforcements likely carried over into the subculture, much like Adidas. Bit of a pause here with what we'd find on the penal code, but I should mention that about 90% of what we could find was related to the academic Adam Gopnik. Speaking of things that are like Gopniks, the Gopnik does have its equivalents across both the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, with the Poles having the Dresiars, the Balkan Dizelazi, even the Romanian Kokalar. If our lovely audience at home wants comparisons to Western groups, think street gangs, delinquents, and the oh-so-fashionable hooligans of the criminal variety. For better effect, combine two or more of these groups, add a case of vodka, and some nationalistic tendencies. So why exactly do Gopniks do what they love to do? Hardbass, petty crime, and non-specific Slavic shenanigans. This is where it gets a bit muddled. We can make some assumptions based off of a lot of working class subcultures and see this as some kind of escape from reality. We could go to root with hooligans and gangs and describe some form of tribalism to survive in an urban jungle. Or we can do what we here at OF do best and throw all assumptions into a blender so we can pad our videos for that sweet, non-existent ad revenue. So why are Gopniks Gopniks? Firstly is that subject I love to talk about. That's right, if you followed this channel since the first season, then you'll know it's escapism. The Gopnik, as a product of the post-Soviet state, is one of a slew of examples of inner-city and suburban youth turning to a community provided by others, in this case semi-gang related, especially in a culture such as Russia's. One of our sources gives the following behind the rise in the Gopnik during the early years of the Federation. Linked closely to social exclusion is the tendency towards the marginalization of new generations of Russian society, a tendency that is not going away, but is only changing its forms. The socialization mechanisms of young people are greatly affected by the prevalence of youth subcultures, both socially positive ones and marginal subcultures that include antisocial ones. These antisocial ones, Gopniks included, serve as a way for these youths to find their others and even temporarily mentally escape the realities of a nation full of corruption and uncertainty. They would gather with those like them, destitute suburban youth and a few elders, and realize that they were all that was needed to fight back against a world that marginalized them for some reason or other. Sadly, this beautifully crafted claim of finding one's community does fall flat if you look at it sociologically, wherein the Gopnik is seen more as a product of the very corruption and uncertainty of the early Federation, turning to petty crime and delinquent gang activity to survive this new environment. With that comes the other idea we had floating around our script: tribalism. Now, we'll touch on this in a bit with the criticism part 2, as the concept of tribalism and gangs is a fun subject, even if the Gopnik is just a loosely organized outlet of delinquent Russian kids. The case of tribalism in Gopniks is much like that with street gangs, wherein they see themselves as either preserving an identity or neighborhood from outside influences, getting some cutbacks either out of respect or force from the community around them. Their territory, be it either a few housing blocks or a suburb, is their domain, and while there isn't much on Gopnik turf wars, more because these guys aren't entirely gangs, there's the occasional fight over one thing or another. The surrounding community, usually reluctantly, acknowledges that the Gopniks are there, but would rather appreciate it if they packed up and went somewhere else. They see a Gopnik more as a pest than anything, playing odd music and gathering in places like stoops or parks to waste the day away being petty thugs. Speaking of which, there is more than just the annoyance factor that exists as a problem with the Gopnik. There is a connection between the Gopnik and criminal culture. I mean, most of where they came from is rooted in either prisoner or sort of a street urchin culture, be it through more petty crimes like pickpocketing or outright stick-ups, to a degree of organized crime under larger organizations. Luckily, the latter is reported few and far between outside a group or two. A lot of urban working-class subcultures will have this, though the only mainstream example I can give would be America's hood culture in the Gopnik's actions and attitude. Gopnik street gangs are what most who live in the old Soviet Union would categorize them under, alongside the annoying wannabes. These groups were prominent in the 80s and 90s, dying out to the other kind of Gopnik for their own actions. Historically, the Gopnik was considered more in line with actual gangsters and mobsters, partaking in the same activities. Nowadays, the subculture is still under the shadow of that criminal influence. Just, now the only crimes they do are shoplifting and asking people for cigarettes. Outside of that, there are gangs that emulate Gopnik culture, such as Russia's prohibited AUE. And if Wikipedia is anything to go by, then also similar groups throughout most of the old Soviet Union. Well, rather, some of these contemporary Gopniks are people emulating both gang and Gopnik culture if we loop back around to the origins of the subculture. Much like people who pretend to be gangbangers because their life in the suburbs is boring here in the US. Outside of emulating gang culture, or actively participating in it, the Gopnik has been connected to more nationalistic and politically extreme components of Russian culture. While more pan-Slavic, with a handful supporting the Putin regime, the Gopnik's nationalist tendencies are only part of the larger extremist picture, with even communists, neo-Nazis, and anarchists existing within the Gopnik subculture. This jingoistic love, or in some parts just acceptance, of Mother Russia does make sense, as a lot of anti-authoritarian subcultures are paradoxically pro their nation. I mean, just look at the bogan and American redneck. What's more Russian than a depressed teen smoking a cigarette and wearing Adidas while looking upon a sea of Khrushchevki? I mean, there's that, but the Russian stereotype is seen in at least two lenses. Somehow the Gopnik has slid itself into the latter, which does make sense. The Gopnik stereotype is entrenched with the contemporary Russian stereotype thanks to cultural depictions. Much like the kilted Scotsman and English-flavored football hooliganism, or the Italian mob have entrenched themselves into the people's first impressions of their respective nations. Surly groups of delinquent young adults and teens in tracksuits and Telyanashkas is painted for many the world over when Russia comes to mind, with both good and bad viewpoints of the Gopnik working their way into media. Modern Russian culture considers the Gopnik and its equivalents more as street trash or less than desirable, with the same comparisons from earlier here in the West holding true. Eli Loeb, who we've referenced throughout this video, cites the mimetic image of the Gopnik as some amalgamation created by more online users. The bygone Gopnik of the 90s was sculpted into the boogeyman of contemporary Russian society to signify non-normal, dislikable, malaligned youth. Going further to cite that the squatting Slav that is the Gopnik has overtaken the previous generation's ideas of Russians as spies, hackers, or anything else under the veil of mystery known as the Cold War for what was actually behind the Iron Curtain, which seems to be weird dashcam footage and an Estonian man saying thanks to video editing. So we can see that, much like mentioned earlier, the Gopnik has entrenched itself into Russia's cultural image for better or worse. And that's the Gopnik. Russia and the Soviet Union's answer to a subculture for the urban youth of a dying empire's proletariat, reborn from a nation's destitute children and urban squalor into something comparable to the chaff or inner city youth, but still holding a great sense of Russianness in their execution. From prisoners and urchins to meme material and wannabe gangsters, the Gopnik has seen it all. Whether it will last another decade or two as an archetype or physically all lays undecided in our current age. What is for certain is that they will continue to squat, rave, and occasionally cause more trouble than they bargained for on the streets of St. Petersburg or Moscow. Speaking of urban streets, I think I ended up in the non-touristy part of Riga. Oh, cool! A trail of sandwichki that leads into this Adidas tracksuit factory that may or may not have kvass. Tato G, Slav drip. I got to sound more like the Galva Latvian. That old G, Slav drip.